This weekend, we're going to be wrapping up our series, RSVP. And if you were with us last week, you know that as we kind of concluded our time together, we gave everyone an opportunity to RSVP yes, an opportunity to say yes to Jesus and to say yes to baptism. And it was an incredible moment. And I just want to take a second to say to those of you who did say yes, thank you so much for making that declaration, to be willing to say, hey, Jesus is my Lord, and I want to take the next step in baptism. But the cool thing for me is not just to be a part of that weekend, but to recognize that we get to invite these people who've said yes into the family of God. See, when you say yes to Jesus, you don't just get to be part of the party, you also get to be part of God's family. And I really do believe that there is no greater family than the family of God. Like, the family of God is filled with love, and it's filled with grace, and it's filled with purpose. And when you say yes to Jesus, you get to call yourself and consider yourself part of this family. Now, even though the family of God is the best family that there is, the truth is it's not perfect. Because we're not perfect people. That we are dysfunctional at times. And so the difficulty becomes, like, we serve a God who is perfect, but yet as we live out our faith, as we live out what it means to be the family of God, we can at times mess up. We can at times make things a priority that shouldn't be a priority. You see, for a lot of us, one of the things that we continually mess up on is, for a lot of us, we approach God and we fall in this mindset, we fall in this trap, and we begin to think that what we really need to do is we need to perform for God. That it's not just enough to be a part of God's family. It's not just enough to be in God's presence. We then begin to think to ourselves, well, there's all these things that we need to do to perform for God. There's all these things that we need to do to somehow become better at being a follower of Jesus. And what happens is, whenever we find ourselves in the performance mindset, we start to judge our performance among somebody else. We start to look at all the things that we're doing to be good Christians, and we compare ourselves to someone else. It happens to all of us. And the thing is, we tell ourselves this, we know, we don't have to be the best follower of Jesus that has ever lived. We just need to be better than that guy. And like, everybody has a that guy. Like, someone you look to and say, okay, I might not be who I want to be. I might not be all that I think Christ is calling me to be, but I'm better than this guy, so I'm better off. And when we get stuck in this performance mentality, what we do is, among the family of God, we begin to jockey for position, for rank. We start to compare ourselves to others, and what we really want to know is, where do we fit in? We don't have to be the best. We just don't want to be the worst. And this whole mindset, this whole performance mentality when it comes to our relationship with God, is something that has been a part of humanity from the very beginning. Matter of fact, last week, if you were here, I briefly touched on an event that Jesus showed up to. Jesus showed up to a dinner party, and when he showed up at this dinner party, he began to see people doing this very thing. People, as they showed up, began to position and to find their place among the party. And it's in this scene that Jesus begins to tell a parable. He tells a story, and this is how it all begins in chapter 14 of the book of Luke. When he noticed, being Jesus, when Jesus noticed how the guests picked the places of honor at the table, he told them this parable. So Jesus notices that when people come in, when they begin to gather at this party, people start picking places of honor. And so Jesus tells them this story, and this is where it continues. Verse 8. When someone invites you to a wedding feast, do not take the place of honor, for a person more distinguished than you may have been invited. So Jesus says, look, if you get invited to a wedding banquet, a wedding party, whatever you do, don't be that guy. Don't be the person that shows up and takes the place of honor. Now, in our world today, we handle this very differently. Most weddings In most weddings, when you show up at a wedding, you are given a seating assignment. Like, you know where you belong. Like, we've already predetermined where you fit in the grand scheme of things. But in the ancient world, it wasn't like this. In Jesus' story, it wasn't like this. In Jesus' story, he's saying a person shows up. And when they show up, this person begins to find the place of honor. And when you become that kind of person, when you show up and you see the table for two at the front of the room and you immediately think, well, that table is for me, or there's some other special table and you show up and think that table is for someone like me, then something's going to happen. This is what Jesus says as he continues. If so, he says, if you're the kind of person that shows up and takes the distinguished seat, the host who invited both of you will come up and say to you, give this person your seat. Like, this is the Forrest Gump moment of the Bible. You know what I'm talking about? This is the moment where you show up and you try to sit down and someone looks at you and says, seat's taken. Like, the seat has been taken. And here's the thing. We look at this and we're like, that's ridiculous. Except as Christians, we do it all the time. You ever show up on a Sunday morning and someone is sitting in your seat? As if somehow you have a seat. Like, we place it out in the morning, oh, this is the seat for so-and-so. Like, if you ever show up, if you're new here, if you ever show up, you're sitting down and someone comes to you and says, you're sitting in my seat, just look at them and say, I can sit here, it's fine, Pastor Mike said so, okay? All right? So this person comes, they sit down, the guest has got to come up, he says, give this person your seat. This seat's not for you. You sat here, it wasn't your seat. Then, humiliated, you will have to take the least important place. You want to know why it's the least important place? It's the only seat left. Because everyone else fell in line. Everyone else assumed their rank. They found their position. When you have this sort of mentality, what it leads to is it leads to humiliation. You will be disappointed. You will be embarrassed. But this is not the way the wedding feast is supposed to go. This is not what Jesus had in mind. Matter of fact, Jesus actually presents a different way. He says this. He says, look, when you are invited to the party, when you are invited, take the lowest place, so that when your host comes, he will say to you, friend, move up to a better place. Then you will be honored in the presence of all the other guests. Jesus says, when you arrive at this party, when you get there, you find the lowest seat. You find the place that no one else wants to sit in, and you sit in that seat. And at some point, the host of the party is going to see the sacrifice that you made and look at you and say, friend, this seat wasn't for you. This seat is actually for you. And then you won't be humiliated among everybody. You will be honored. Now, here's the thing. There is a tension in many of us to see something like this and go, oh, I could do this. I could play that part. But what I want us to understand is what Jesus is getting at here isn't some sort of false humility. He's not saying, hey, just show up and do the thing. Like, play your part, go sit in the lowest seat, just so that everyone can show up and see what a sacrifice that you've made so that you can be elevated to the best seat. Like, that's not what Jesus is getting at. Jesus' point is that when you show up, you should just be so grateful, so excited to have even been invited to this party that you don't care where you sit. That being there is a privilege in itself. It's an honor. That there should be humility and gratitude that these people decided to invite you to their wedding banquet. And I imagine as Jesus closes up this story, he looks directly at the Pharisees, and he says these words to them to assure that his point is crystal clear. He says, for all those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. He says, all of you Pharisees who show up and think this party is really for you, make no mistake, you will be humbled. But if you're the kind of person that humbly shows up at this party, recognizing what a gracious act it is for you to even be able to be in this room, that you will be lifted up. And even though Jesus was directly talking to the Pharisees, I can't help but notice the application it has for us today. Because we fight this temptation. We want to know where we rank. As a part of God's family, where do we sit? And this is especially true for those of us who've been following Jesus for a long time. But notice what Jesus says here. Jesus says these words in Matthew in chapter 20. He says, so the last will be first, and the first will be last. This is what I think Jesus is getting at. If you pride yourself on being first, if you look at it and go, I've been walking with Jesus for 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, 50 years. If you pride yourself on the longevity of your relationship with Jesus, not because of what Jesus has done in your life, but because, well, look at all the things that I have done to make myself a good follower of Jesus. If that's what you lead with, the first will be last. But Jesus also says that the last. Those of you who have said yes to Jesus maybe last week or in the last couple of months, those of you who haven't quite figured out that apparently we posture for position as part of God's family, those people who were just grateful to be at the party will be first. All of us have to fight the temptation to perform for Jesus. Because when we begin to get stuck in this performance mentality, we get stuck in position, in rank, in priority. And I'm not just telling you that this is something that you need to be aware of and mindful of. It's something that I have struggled with as well. It's part of my story. I graduated with my bachelor's degree in advertising, fully intending to go into marketing. I thought I was going to graduate and I was going to go get a job at some marketing firm and have a great life, and that's what the plan was. But somewhere along the way, God got a hold of me and called me to go into ministry. And what I recognized in that moment was that I don't know what I'm doing. Like, good or bad news, I still don't know what I'm doing. But I recognized, God was calling me into ministry, and there was so much that I needed to learn. And so when I graduated with my bachelor's degree, I sort of immediately went on to work on my master's degree to really learn about who God is and what He's called the church to be, and how do we as people grow closer to God in our relationship with Him? How do we help people find and follow Him? I started to think about all of these things as a part of my education. When I finished up my master's degree, I realized as much as I've learned, there was still a whole lot more that I needed to learn. So I continued on in school. I took more classes. I learned more about who God is and how He interacts with humanity. And eventually, when I finished kind of all that, I was like, well, you don't stop at a master's degree. And so I applied for my doctoral program, and I got into the program. And for a couple years, I went and I learned more, and I understood God more. And here's the temptation in all of that. I begin to look at all that I've done. Look at all this work that I've done. Look at all the classes that I've taken. Look at all the money that I've spent on these classes. Let's just be honest. Of course that seat's for me. Of course that place of distinguished honor is for me. You haven't taken that many classes. You didn't pay that much money. I'm the one who belongs in the seat of honor. But that's not true. It's not true for me, and it's not true for you. And then if you are looking at your life, if you're looking at your faith through the lens of trying to figure out what place you find yourself among everyone else, what's your rank, what's your position, you're approaching God with the wrong mentality and the wrong heart. See, the beautiful thing about God's kingdom is that we're all one together. Matter of fact, this is what Paul says in the book of Romans. In Romans chapter 10, he says, look, for there is no difference. There's no difference between Jew and Gentile. The same Lord is Lord of all and richly blesses all who call on Him. Paul says, literally, we're all the same. That there's no difference between Jew and Gentile. Now you have to understand, when Paul says this, every Jewish person would have had a significant problem with this statement. And just so we all know, Jews are the people of Israel, Gentiles is everyone else. So Paul says, you are both the same, and the people of Israel are like, no. Like, we're God's people. Like, we're God's chosen people. We've been at this whole following God thing for a lot longer than these Gentiles. Like, what do you mean there's no difference? We're obviously more important than they are. But what we need to understand when it comes to God's family is that's not true. Paul's statement is 100% correct, that there is no difference, that we're all one, and that God blesses all who call on his name. He blesses us all equally who call on his name. And then Paul continues. He says, for everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. Everyone who calls on the name of the Lord. It doesn't matter what their past is. It doesn't matter what their present is. It doesn't matter the mistakes they've made, how big those mistakes are. It doesn't matter how many people they've hurt. Everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. That's the amazing thing with God's family. That all of us, from our fractured, broken past, from our upbringings, from our mistakes, we are all made whole in Jesus. We are brought together at this party to be part of his family. Now here's the thing. Just like every family has a set of expectations, the same is true when it comes to God's family. When we are part of God's family, what's clear to me, especially as you read throughout the pages of Scripture, is that it's not enough just to get in the party, to just be there. Like, you don't just arrive at God's family and then immediately have nothing that you're expected to do. Like, you know, as a part of your family, whether you're younger and you're living at home or you're a parent who has kids at home, like, there are certain expectations. There are certain things as a family that you expect people to do. And the reality is, when it comes to our relationship with God, when it comes to being part of God's family, we have family expectations. Now, even as I say this, I recognize that there's a part of all of us, especially those of us who are driven by performance mentality, to think, okay, well, tell me what the expectations are. Like, I'll go ahead and do all of the expectations. Like, you just give me the list, and I'll just work down the list. I'll be the best Christian that I could ever be. Like, we immediately fall into that performance mentality. And when we get there, we start thinking that way, we actually make following Jesus a whole lot more difficult than it really needs to be. So here's the thing. I believe there's really just two expectations that come with being part of God's family. Jesus was asked by a group of Pharisees, they said, what's the most important thing for us to do? And this is Jesus' answer. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all of your soul and with all your mind. Like, love God with everything that you have. You want to know what it means to be part of God's family? You want to know what's expected of you? That you would love God with everything that you have. And this is not just a decision you make one time and never again. This is a decision you make every single day. That you wake up and say, God, how do I love you with everything that I have today? How do I direct all of my decision making around who you are calling me to be and where you're leading me? God, how do I love you with everything? That is the first and most important expectation of being a member of God's family. But it's not the only one. Shortly after Jesus was resurrected, he gathered with some of his disciples, and he began to talk and share with them. And as a part of this time together, he gave them what has become known as the Great Commission. And I really feel like that's one of the second expectations we have as a part of God's family. This is what Jesus would say. He says, therefore go and make disciples of all nations. He says, you want to know what's expected of you? It's not that you just love God with everything you have. That's expected. It's so important. But it's also that you would be the kind of person that would go out and make disciples. That you'd be the kind of person who understands that you have a personal responsibility to share your faith with others so that they could come into a life-giving relationship with Jesus. So that they could be invited to the party. So that they could be part of the family. One of the things I love about the story last week, if you were with us last week, you know that the servant went out. The servant went out to tell everyone that the party was here. And even though he got rejected, he didn't stop. That as the master continued to send him out, he continued to go out and tell everyone, the party's happening now, and you are invited. And the thing is, for us as Christ followers, one of our family expectations is that we would be the kind of people who invite others, that we would go and make disciples. Now maybe some of you know kind of the theology behind the Jehovah's Witnesses. Perhaps most of you don't, but the reality is probably all of us have had an experience or an encounter with a Jehovah's Witness in our life. And here's one of the things that just blows my mind. Jehovah's Witnesses believe that there is 144,000 people that will get to heaven. That's a solid number. 144,000 people get to go to heaven. And what do Jehovah's Witnesses do with that information? They literally go and tell everyone about it, knowing that there is the possibility that someone they tell will take their place. I mean, think about that for a second. They knowingly tell others about the party, even though that very act might get them uninvited. And they still do it. Now, here's the thing. As Christ followers, we believe everyone gets to the party. Everyone's invited. That there's no limit, that the house has always more room. That you can keep inviting, and sharing, and asking people to come in to experience God. There is no limit to God's house. And you know what we do? Most of us tell no one. We don't. Why is that? Why is it that we somehow believe that we have the greatest message that the world has ever seen? That we hold a message that has not only changed our life here and now, but it's shaped our eternity. And we have the opportunity to share it with other people. It's not just something that would be good to do. Jesus says it's an expectation if you want to be part of this family. And yet, again and again, we fail to do it. These are our family expectations. That we would love God with all that we have and all that we are. And that we would go tell others about it, that we would go and make disciples. But you see, families, they aren't just about expectations. Families also have celebrations. Every family has celebrations. And maybe even as I say that, you start to think of your family. Like, what are the things in your family that you do to celebrate? My family, we have family celebrations. One of the ones that we hold so dear to us was instituted on November 29th, 2014. That day was the Friday after Thanksgiving. And on that day, my oldest daughter, she was 5 years old at the time, Alessia, declared that every Friday after Thanksgiving Day is Family Ship Day. That this was a day for us to celebrate as a family. And of course, like, you hear a word like, what is Family Ship Day? Like, where did that come from? So we asked her, and this is a quote from my 5-year-old daughter at the time. Family Ship Day is a day where we spend time with family and grow to love them more. This has become a significant family celebration. You see, every Thanksgiving, at this point, we almost have like the obligatory, like, where are we going for Thanksgiving dinner? Like, who's cooking? What are we responsible for? Are we hosting? Are we inviting people over? Okay, let's get that out of the way. Now we get to talk about Family Ship Day. It is our family's celebration. And your family, my guess, your family has some celebration that is just like it. It's a way, maybe it's a day or a season or a time that happens where you celebrate something from your family's history. And the same is true when it comes to God's family. That we have significant family celebrations. You probably don't need me to tell you, but two of the major ones are Christmas, which is literally like 2 months away. You're welcome. Glad to stress you out. But Christmas is the opportunity that we have to be reminded that Jesus, the Lord of all, entered into humanity. He entered into this world to change it forever. And then every spring we celebrate Easter. We celebrate As a family, it's a reminder that God, through Jesus, who sacrificed himself on the cross, created for all of us, for all of humanity, a way back to God. These are some of the significant celebrations that we have as a family. But there's another one. If you remember what Jesus said, this is what Jesus said, just bringing us back. Jesus said, therefore go and make disciples of all nations. Just go. Go share your faith. Go share what you believe with others, helping them come to find and follow Jesus. Go do these things. But this is not where this verse ends. Jesus continues. That we then baptize them. That we baptize them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit. This baptism is one of our family celebrations. It is one of the things that we get to do together. It's a way that we get to celebrate what God is doing in the life of not just an individual, but what God is doing in the life of this church. And as we wrap up this time this morning, that we're going to take the opportunity to celebrate as a family. In just a second, the band's going to come out and they're going to play some songs. And you know this, every great party has great music. So we're going to sing some songs together. And then we're going to stop and we're going to baptize someone. And when we do that, here's what I'm going to ask of you. I'm going to ask that you celebrate. That you celebrate probably like you've never celebrated a baptism before. That you celebrate the fact that someone this morning, and multiple people in first service, made the declaration that on this day, in front of the people they love, in front of their family, that they have been made new. Every family has a celebration. And today is one of ours.